At 12:25 a.m. on September 12, 2025, two oil tankers sat quietly at Russia's Primorsk port. They were preparing to load millions of barrels bound for the Shadow Fleet. 10 minutes later, radar operators hundreds of kilometers away saw something they couldn't explain. Dozens of faint signals moving toward Russian airspace in perfect formation. Within minutes, alarms echoed across command centers, from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. No one knew it yet, but Ukraine had just launched one of the most complex drone operations in modern warfare. Here follows the story of a 1,000-kilometer strike that destroys a city and blinds an empire. Months of planning in Kyiv built the skeleton of this attack. Planners solved range, refueling, and navigation problems long before a single drone lifted off. They also had to outthink something far larger than hardware: Russia's layered air defense umbrella, the kind NATO calls an anti-access/area denial bubble. Russian officers expected this sort of test and trusted their systems to handle it. Russia's defenses reacted exactly as designed. S-400 engagement radars began locking sequentially. Pancir S-1 batteries replied with a torrent of 30mm fire that could shred the sky. Command centers displayed tidy kill chains and green status lights. The posture read calm, while the doctrine read confident. Later, that confidence became a vulnerability. Kyiv's plan used hundreds of low-cost platforms to force choices. 35 plywood-bodied AQ-400 scythes served as bait. Notably, those were cheap, quiet, and easy to build in numbers. Another 40 drones formed the main effort, distributed across Leningrad Oblast to force multiple local responses. At the center of the strike group, planners placed extended-range UJ-26 Bober ERS. Engineers modified fuel tanks and tuned engines so these kamikaze drones could fly a one-way 1,000-kilometer march, carrying 40-kilogram warheads. Electronic warfare assets received the same treatment. Banshee 7s rode the long-range airframe equipped with jamming pods instead of explosives to escort the attackers all the way. Every element was important. The plywood decoys had to draw big sensors and big missiles. The Bober ERs had to survive the corridor that the decoys opened. The Banshees had to keep those corridors noisy enough to hide the true attack. When all those pieces connected, the attack would become absolutely surgical. Midnight saw coordinated launches across Ukraine. More than 70 drones climbed low and slipped toward the border, following riverbeds and tree lines mapped into their navigation stacks. Every craft ran on preloaded terrain data and autonomous steering. Radio silence kept them invisible to human listeners. Engineers expected that some drones would crash. Some would die of mechanical faults, and the plan wisely accommodated those losses. Hours later, Russian radars finally registered the swarm. Big area sensors prioritized the cluster threatening St. Petersburg and sent volleys of S-400 missiles after the plywood sides. Those cheap decoys behaved exactly as intended by drawing expensive interceptors and attention. On the other channels, dozens of other drones spread across Leningrad Oblast and began a lethal game of cat and mouse with Pancir and Buk crews. One Pancir near Volosovsky locked a UJ-26 Bober. The Russian fire control screen fed telemetry and a clean track. The Ukrainian operator watching that same signal did not panic. A nearby Banshee 7 had already keyed its jammer to the Pancir's X-band, and the Russian screen went white. The lock collapsed. Cannons and missiles followed, but targets disappeared into darkness. This loop repeated across batteries. Radar locks, blinding interference, burned missiles, and wreckage were scattered across fields. Russian crews shot down dozens. 33 drones fell in a hail of flak around central Leningrad. Those losses looked like victory on the feeds. For Kyiv, they were deliberate sacrifices that opened the corridor the planners needed. From behind the noise, a tiny team of 7 extended-range Bober ERS slipped through the gaps and threaded toward Primorsk. The defenders were watching the chessboard's corner. The actual move had already begun. Pre-dawn confusion turned decisive when Primorsk's local air defense crew suddenly saw 7 blips closing in way faster than expected. The Pancir battery responded with almost everything available. 57 E-6 interceptors roared into the low sky. The attackers split with purpose. 3 drones bore down on the port's pumping station, while the other 4 angled for vessels at the berth. One of the trio was struck a few hundred meters out, but the remaining 2 hit where it mattered. The first slammed into the pumping station's control hub with a thermobaric warhead. It was sucking oxygen from the enclosed space and ripping the structure apart with an overpressure wave. Seconds later, the second struck the main pipeline manifold, severed the port's circulation, and knocked out its lifelines. At the pier, the 4 remaining UJ-26s found their targets. 2 dove on the Capitan Lob. 1 detonated beneath the bridge and fried critical electronics. The other punched through a cargo tank and ignited a massive blaze. Sergei Gorskov took near identical punishment. 1 strike to the engine room, another to the loading manifolds, while 2 large Aframax-class tankers from the Shadow Fleet, the Cousteau and the Kailun, were hit during final loading. Damage included ruptured tanks, disabled control systems, and leaking fuel that fed spreading infernos. Mess literally cascaded. A short circuit in the port's control center triggered an emergency shutdown that never propagated because the core energy system had also been damaged. Loading arms at the tankers were ripped open by fire. Pump valves were destroyed. Containment failed. 42 seconds after the initial blast, Terminal 2's pumping station collapsed. Within minutes, Primorsk resembled a furnace with burning tankers, a crippled pumping complex, and a control room that could do nothing but record the destruction. By sunrise, Primorsk was a column of smoke, visible from miles out to sea. 2 tankers burned like floating refineries, and the port's pumping system was a pile of twisted metal. Within hours, the Russian Defense Ministry issued its version of events. 221 Ukrainian drones had been shot down overnight, and all attacks had been successfully repelled. The statement didn't survive its first satellite photo. The image showed billions in losses, 2 crippled tankers, and one of Russia's largest oil terminals silenced. Primorsk alone handled nearly 20% of the country's seaborne exports. Every hour it stayed offline meant close to 1 million barrels of oil stranded on shore, a financial hit of $70 to $80 million a day. The strike hadn't just destroyed a port, but ruined one of the arteries that fed Russia's war economy. Farther south, air traffic controllers in St. Petersburg scrambled to make sense of the noise. 11 flights were diverted as civil and military radar screens overflowed with targets, many of them wreckage or debris from earlier interceptions. Emergency services reported fragments falling across Leningrad's outskirts. The airspace was drowned in false echoes and fading returns. While every radar operator stared upward, the actual blow had already landed at sea. Analysts pieced together what had happened. Ukraine's long-range drone plan had achieved 3 technical breakthroughs. It solved the endurance problem with modified engines and extra fuel tanks, and overwhelmed decision-making by flooding sensors with cheap decoys. Finally, it used electronic warfare drones to feed it hundreds of phantom signatures that made threats disappear in the clutter. Recovered drone fragments near Usmino and Pokrovskaya confirmed this architecture. Some airframes carried only navigation modules or jamming antennas. These weren't all weapons. Many were illusions given wings. The goal was a deception so complete that even after the explosions, Russian analysts couldn't trace how the attackers had slipped through. By the time Moscow's morning brief reached senior commanders, the war's front lines were still intact. However, its logistics backbone had been gutted. Primorsk had proven that 1,000 kilometers of distance, radar walls, and layered defense systems meant nothing when the attack came disguised as noise. Morning light revealed what the night refused to hide. Primorsk was still burning. The sea had turned black, carrying sheets of fire that drifted with the tide. Cranes stood warped and silent. In the command bunkers, nobody spoke for a long time. The screens still glowed green. Systems are operational. They had built their fortress to face the west, and the strike had come from behind their backs. At Polovo Airport, controllers sat frozen before a storm of false targets. Every few seconds, a blip appeared, vanished, and was replaced by another. Outside, wreckage fell across the outskirts of Leningrad. Pieces of drones, metal, and what was left of certainty. The heartbeat of Russia's northern trade got replaced by the slow hiss of oil burning on water. In Kyiv, the engineers who had designed the plan watched live feeds. Some smiled, most didn't. Nor had they celebrated. They simply understood that the strike had broken the belief that Russia's heartland was untouchable. Somewhere in Kyiv, someone is already sketching the next plan. Subscribe to see how it unfolds.